Hello, everyone, and here we are again for another crazy alternate scenario, as I've liked to do since my beginnings, similar to my story about Augustus being immortal or Justinian being able to see the future. So yes, I hope it's totally obvious that this story won't be realistic at all. And this time, we will cover an alternate timeline where we will ask ourselves the following thing. What if Romulus, the legendary founder of the city of Rome, was really the son of Mars? And Remus, but he doesn't matter. How would the history of early antiquity have unfolded if the legendary founder of the city of Rome had actually existed in the 8th century BCE? And more importantly, how would the ancient world have reacted upon learning of the existence of a being at least semi-divine like him? All of that is what we will see in this video, although first, I think it is necessary to clarify multiple details about Romulus and Remus, their relationship with the gods in that story, and their clear and established limits with their demigod powers. To begin, let's establish that in this alternate timeline, Romulus and Remus are the only humans who are truly descendants of a god like Mars. No other god from Roman or Greek mythology would have manifested themselves among mortals to conceive other known demigods, as is the case of Hercules or Achilles. The history of humanity, and of humans themselves, will continue to be exactly the same as in the real world, with only Romulus and Remus having in that world a kind of superhuman advantage over the other mortals. And in general, regarding the question of the existence of the gods, we are going to adopt a view similar to that of the movie Troy with Brad Pitt. That is, yes, the gods technically exist, but at the same time, they are invisible and do not appear, and they are not at all relevant to the story, nor will they ever interfere with the mortals, the only exception being the god Mars, who was too horny, I guess, in order to not be tempted to come down among mortals to conceive with a mortal woman. And now, regarding the question of Romulus and Remus's powers, let's quickly establish just how far their abilities extend. Let's be honest, if Romulus and Remus had even 1% of the power and feats that the god Mars is capable of in Roman mythology, or Greek mythology for its Hellenic equivalent Ares, literally Romulus and Remus could conquer and dominate the whole world in just a few years very easily, and that would be too overpowered and boring for a video. So instead, I'm going to establish what the true power and advantage of those two will be among mortals, that power being the power of eternal growth. What do I mean by eternal growth? Simply put, Romulus and Remus would be initially born as two seemingly ordinary human babies, completely normal, and with absolutely nothing special compared to the rest of mortals. The only difference is that, while a normal human will sooner or later reach their limit upon becoming an adult, and will not be able to continue getting stronger no matter how much they train, they will continue to be able to surpass their limits forever. To give you a practical example, it is as if Eddie Hall, after having deadlifted his record of 500 kilos or 1,100 pounds, instead of almost being on the verge of death from such an effort, he would have continued training, and 6 months later he would have returned to deadlift this time 600 kilos, or more than 1,300 pounds. And then after that, he would have continued training until he could lift many tons in just a few years of constant training. That's what I mean by eternal growth. But in the case of Romulus and Remus, their improvement and growth in brute strength and physical performance would be general. So, for example, Romulus and Remus are not immortal and will initially have a lifespan equal to that of a normal human. However, if they train their bodies enough to reach superhuman levels of strength, their entire body and the rest of their abilities would adapt to balance with their new limits. For example, if at some point Romulus and Remus are 10 times stronger than a normal human could possibly become, then they would be 10 times stronger, but also 10 times faster, more resistant, and with 10 times more stamina, and 10 times longer lived, that is, being able to live for centuries or even a millennium. So basically, if Romulus and Remus don't want to die out of natural causes by getting old, they'll have to constantly train and push their limits, which suits them well as the sons of the god of war. And although, after multiple centuries, that could make them very powerful beings by realistic human standards, it also means that during the beginning of their lives, during their childhood, youth, and by the time the two brothers fought to the death so that Romulus could found the city of Rome, they, being very young at that point in history, will not yet have developed any superhuman abilities, being totally vulnerable to being defeated or surpassed by other humans, or being seriously injured by weapons such as swords, spears, or arrows. That makes them, at least for the purpose of creating an interesting story for this video, certainly incredible and exceptional, but at the same time, still vulnerable and weak enough that they simply don't conquer the entire planet like some kind of divine Superman. And so, having explained all that, it's time to really begin that alternate scenario. So, to begin with, and as I said previously, Romulus and Remus's divine potential would not be one they would discover right away, having been born as completely normal, human babies, and having to wait many years for their bodies to grow and mature to reach a reasonable adult strength before being able to push their limits to exploit their semi-divine potential. That means that the entire origin of Romulus and Remus, as the legend tells it, their abandonment by the Tiber River, being saved by a she-wolf, being raised by a shepherd, and everything else such as helping Numitor become king of Alba Longa again, would still happen the same as in the original story, or at least as the original legend tells it. It should be noted that by that point, Romulus and Remus were still very young, with the multiple versions of the legend mostly agreeing that Romulus and Remus, being twins, were both around 18 years old when they helped Numitor and decided to found their own city themselves, so at that point, they would still be completely normal humans without any feat of supernatural power. However, knowing the extremely harsh and hostile lifestyle that was living in the Italian peninsula of the 8th century BCE, I have no doubt that such a rustic lifestyle, pushing you to survive every day, would have already made them two exceptionally athletic and very strong young men for their age, capable of putting any modern elite athlete to shame at that point. And in any case, that wouldn't matter too much, because in the end, just as the legend tells it, Romulus would end up killing Remus, being the victor of a brutal and bloody fight to the death, barely winning against his brother, but thus leaving him free rein to decide and impose his own decisions on how he was going to found his own city, the city that we will one day know as Rome. To imagine what that city would look like, we must remember the real 8th century BCE, a time of scattered villages, crude huts of clay and thatch, surrounded by forests and marshes. Italy was not yet a land of marble and columns, but of wolves, shepherds, and smoke from cooking fires. Most, quote-unquote, cities were little more than fortified hilltops, clusters of wooden huts surrounded by ditches. So when Romulus began laying the foundations of his settlement on the Palatine Hill, he would be building a metropolis, founding a fortress. And that choice makes sense, as the son of Mars, even if he doesn't yet know what that means. Romulus would think already like a soldier, like a warrior. Every decision he makes would be pragmatic, defensive, and strategic. He would choose the Palatine not for beauty, but for position. It overlooks the Tiber crossing, controls trade between the Etruscans to the north and the Latins to the south, and can be easily defended from raids. In short, he would build a city of war long before Rome ever fights one. The first Roman huts, in this timeline, would rise faster and stronger than in ours. Romulus organizes his settlers with near-military precision, assigning roles, duties, and watch rotations. He enforces discipline among shepherds and fugitives who, in any other town, would have been bandits. Under his command, they become the nucleus of a standing militia. He teaches them formation fighting, spear drills, and camp construction, ideas that no other Latin leader has formalized yet. Religion would also follow the same martial instinct. The first temple he would order to be built would not be for Jupiter or Vesta, but for Mars, the god of war, and in this timeline, his own father. Every morning, the men of Rome perform simple rites of strength, running, lifting, sparring, acts of devotion disguised as training. Romulus is unknowingly forging what will one day become the Roman military ethos, to worship the gods by imitating them. And though he does not yet sense the divine power growing within, the city he builds already mirrors his nature, pragmatic, austere, and ambitious. While other tribes build towns to live in, Romulus builds one to conquer from. By the time the first wooden walls and ditches are complete, the settlement already looks unlike anything else in Latium. Travelers passing through the valley would have seen a strange sight: men marching in rhythm, huts arranged in perfect order, and a young king who seems to never sleep. A legend begins to form, whispered among the shepherds and merchants, that the founder of the new city on the Palatine is not entirely human. And as the months passed, that rumor would only grow stronger. While other Latin villages still prayed for harvest, Rome would be drilling for war. Every wall, every hut, every open space would have a purpose. The Palatine would have become both a home and a barracks, a sanctuary and a fortress. Romulus's followers, drawn from exiles, wanderers, and fugitives, would soon begin to understand that their king was no ordinary man. He could lift stones that took 3 men to move, march all day without water, and recover from wounds that would cripple others. Yet, rather than proclaim himself divine, Romulus would stay silent, at least for now. He would tell them that strength was not given by the gods, but that it was earned. And in doing so, he created something new, a city founded not on bloodline or wealth, but on discipline and effort, his discipline and personal effort in training himself to become stronger every day being a great inspiration to all his subjects and his militia. The early Roman law code, if we can call it that, would have reflected this mindset. Punishments would be harsh but fair, rewards simple but honorable. The lazy were banished, and the brave would be given land. Rome would be less a kingdom than a training ground for civilization. Meanwhile, word of this strange new settlement would begin to spread across Latium. The Sabines to the north and the Latins of Alba Longa would observe all of this with suspicion. They would ask themselves, who was that guy building an armed camp in the middle of the Tiber Valley? Envoys would be sent, alliances proposed and broken. Some thought of him a prophet of Mars, others a dangerous and scary tyrant. Romulus, pragmatic as always, mixed both war and diplomacy. He offered asylum to all, runaway slaves, debtors, exiles, even criminals, so long as they obeyed his laws and fought under his command. In a single generation, the population exploded, religion evolved with the same discipline, with the cult of Mars becoming central to daily life. And after just a few years, many Italian tribes and city-states would have already sworn their allegiance to Romulus, such as the Sabines themselves, and a large part of the Latins. Under Romulus's command, iron would replace bronze faster than in any other place in Italy or beyond. Blacksmiths would be revered like priests due to their skill with iron. Weapons would become both sacred and symbolic, the physical expression of human excellence. After barely a decade old, the city of Rome would already look like the embryo of a future empire. But a city built on discipline must always test itself, and Romulus's growing obsession with strength would begin to shape not only his people, but his own destiny. As the years passed, he would notice subtle changes in himself. His recovery from wounds would become faster, his endurance greater, and his sleep shorter. He could train for hours without fatigue, his hair did not gray, and his vision would grow sharper. At first, he dismissed it as luck or resilience, the reward of a warrior's lifestyle, what we would call in our modern times having good genes. But deep down, he would begin to feel it, to feel that something within him was awakening, something powerful, something almost divine. Rome would start to become powerful by early antiquity standards, and so would its founder. After only 1 or 2 decades, Romulus's Rome would have become a phenomenon among the other Italian tribes. What would have started as a fortified refuge for outcasts would have turned into a disciplined war machine surrounded by bewildered neighbors. Caravans traveling between the Etruscans and the southern Latins would speak of a king whose men drilled in perfect rhythm, whose walls were raised with mathematical precision, and whose banners bore the image of a wolf and a spear, symbols that would soon inspire both reverence and fear. At first, most nearby tribes tried to ignore Rome's rise, but ignoring Romulus would be a mistake. Every raid that struck his borders, every insult from a rival chief, would be answered with organized, terrifying efficiency. For the first time in the history of Latium, battles were fought not as chaotic brawls, but as coordinated assaults. Romulus arranged his warriors in disciplined lines, with shields overlapping and spears braced, the earliest form of what centuries later would become a Roman legion in our timeline. And his own presence on the battlefield would be unlike anything the peninsula had ever seen. Witnesses would later claim that he could run through mud faster than a horse, that he could hurl a javelin farther than any man alive, and that wounds closed upon him as though Mars himself guarded his flesh. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. He was simply growing stronger by training very hard every day. Every battle, every hardship, every wound that healed made him tougher, faster, and more enduring. Without realizing it, Romulus was slowly transforming from a human into a superhuman, a demigod. His first major campaign would be against the Volsci and certain recalcitrant Latin towns that would have resisted his authority, but instead of simply destroying them, Romulus offered them a bargain: serve Rome and share its destiny. Those who accepted would be integrated, their warriors becoming citizens, their gods absorbed into the Roman cult. Those who refused would be crushed, their survivors enslaved or resettled within Rome's expanding territory. By the 730s BCE, the influence of Romulus could realistically stretch across central Italy at bare minimum. Trade would flow through its markets, envoys from Etruria and the Sabine Hills would begin sending gifts to buy the good graces of this ambitious king with crazy feats of strength and military prowess. And with every victory, Romulus's legend would spread further. Whether those tales were the truth or fear hardly mattered. What mattered would be that people eventually would have started to believe them. And belief, as always in human history, would be the greatest weapon of all to control the masses. By that point, Romulus himself would be entering what we would call middle age, though to his soldiers, he would look no older than a man in his early 30s, with his muscles denser, his reflexes faster, his stamina unmatched. He could fight for a day and build for another without rest. he would begin to understand dimly that his body was not bound by the limits of other men. The more he trained, the more he seemed to grow, not only in power but also in vitality and longevity. And as his divine blood awakened, so too would his ambition. By the late 8th century BCE, Romulus's Rome, I dare say, Romulus's Roman Empire, could have dominated and subjugated all the Italic peoples on the Italian peninsula, with his feats, achievements, and influence echoing across the seas. Merchants from Sardinia, Corsica, and even as far away as Carthage would bring tales of a city, and by then an empire ruled by a man who never aged, a king whose army trained like clockwork, whose discipline rivaled that of the old Bronze Age's armies of legend. To some, these would be stories invented by traders to sell iron and olive oil, but to others, especially to the philosophers of the Greek world, they would be a disturbing possibility. Because around that same time, the first Greek colonies would have begun to appear in southern Italy. Cities like Cumae and Pithecusae would be founded by settlers from Euboea and Corinth, who brought with them writing, coinage, and the knowledge of a much wider world. And when their ships anchored on the Italian coast, they would hear rumors that seemed at first impossible. Curious, and perhaps a little afraid, the Greeks would send envoys north, expecting to find another barbarian chieftain, but instead they would discover something else entirely. A city extremely urbanized and wealthy for that time, filled with disciplined soldiers sparring in the fields. Temples to Mars being worshipped, looking more like military exercises than religion. And at the center of it all, a man in his 70s who looked like he was 30, whose eyes burned with the calm fire of someone who knew no limit. The Greek envoys would return home both fascinated and terrified. They would write, or rather dictate, since few could yet write, that Italy was no longer the land of shepherds and brigands, but that of a people united under a being who might, just might, be divine, or at least semi-divine, and that if left unchecked, his ambition could one day extend beyond the peninsula. In Syracuse, poets would describe him as the second Heracles. In Carthage, sailors would whisper tales about his incredible superhuman feats, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, and sometimes completely invented. In mainland Greece itself, philosophers would debate whether he was a demigod or a tyrant touched by madness. But by then, in all of Italy, there would not be debate, there would only be certainty. For his soldiers, Romulus was already the living son of Mars, proof that the gods had not abandoned mankind but lived among them, testing their courage with the presence of a demigod like their king. And Romulus himself would have started to realize that his strength no longer came from training alone. His body would have become an instrument of divine will, a bridge between mortal and God. He could feel his heartbeat slow, his mind sharpen, his senses expand, and with every sunrise, he grew a little stronger, a little faster, but also a little less human. And by the year 700 BCE, Rome would dominate all of Italy, except for the newly arrived Greeks and their colonies. The Mediterranean world would slowly waking up to a new power, one not born from bronze palaces or ancient dynasties, but from a single man who refused to die or even getting old. And though centuries of history still lay ahead, the fate of the ancient world would have already changed. By then, Romulus, older but not weaker, would look beyond the river that once saw his brother and him being saved by a she-wolf, looking toward lands still unconquered, and would know that one day they too would belong to Rome. And so, the son of Mars would have taken up his weapons, not to defend his city and everything he worked so hard to build in those last 5 decades, but to prepare for the next step in his destiny, to let the other ancient civilizations around the Mediterranean know of his existence, of the truth of his divine origins, and of the important role that his now empire would play in the future, and perhaps one day the conquest of the entire known world and even beyond. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this funny and crazy proposal of an alternate timeline where Romulus, the founder of Rome, actually existed and was also really the son of the god Mars. If you want to see a second part to that story, where we'll explore Romulus's interactions with the rest of the civilizations around the Mediterranean, the goal for a part 2 will be 500 likes on this video. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel if you want to support me in my work, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to the newest members of the channel, PJ the Homeless Mage, Stephen Bates, and Aiden Edwin Payne. Shout out to all 3 of you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time.